Let's start without a delay, and I guess colleagues will continue to join. Let's not keep people waiting. So, dear colleagues and partners, we are very happy to welcome you all to the second webinar of our 2020 ODA Learning Series. I'm Berna Bayazıt from Istanbul Regional Hub Partnerships team. So for those who first joined us with this webinar, let me provide you some quick background. Since 2014, UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub has been organizing ODA capacity development series on topics of high priority for new and emerging development cooperation providers in Europe and Central Asia. And starting from 2020 and due to the global COVID pandemic crisis, we moved to an online platform and started doing webinars and joined forces with OECD for this initiative. And this is actually a part of a broader community of practice that brings together development cooperation providers of this region and which runs on an online platform, Spark Blue. So these webinars aim to bring us together with speakers, experts and practitioners who will exchange their knowledge and experience around these identified topics of high interest. And these topics are also discussed and identified jointly with our partners. The topic of this week's webinar, following on from last week, is development cooperation in and post-COVID era, which was collectively selected by all of us and with our partners as a very relevant topic, which impacts all walks of life, macroeconomics, as well as development cooperation. Last week, we had another webinar, this time, the same time on Thursday. That's what we repeat every Thursday. Last week, we focused on the ways COVID-19 impacts development cooperation, as well as the future challenges and opportunities it poses. Today, we will, together with our speakers and participants, look at how the pandemic actually impacted the global economy and the immediate socioeconomic impacts, as well as how the private sector and the business sector is coping with, and of course, from a development cooperation lens. Today, we will have three distinguished speakers to share their insights and experiences, which will be followed by a plenary discussion. And although we will have a Q&A session where we will have joint questions and comments, in case you will have any question about a specific presentation, please send those questions, share those questions, and we just after the presentation. So we will have some time for one or two quick questions also for interaction. Before we move on to the content of the webinar, just a few housekeeping issues. So we're using Zoom meeting. So please keep yourself muted and please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, or you can also type in the chat box. We will continuously check the chat box. And if your connection allows, we would please open your camera so that we all see each other and have a more personal interaction. I don't want to take more time, and before I pass the floor to our first speaker, we have a quick poll for you to check your knowledge and insights about the global impact of COVID, and this will also help us smoothly transition to the topic. So so this is our first question. So in which sector the global demand fell the most due to COVID-19? Healthcare, information technologies, tourism and services, agriculture, or construction? Yeah, so we have some more to go. Yeah, I think we're still, some colleagues are responding. Okay, so this is the first one. So yeah, so this is the tourism and services and healthcare seem to be the first two sectors that our colleagues think mostly impacted. We won't share the results, but our next session will help you with the responses. And we can go to the second question. So what is the current global GDP growth projection for 2020? So is it 13% increase, 15, 18% decline, 10% increase, 4 to 8% decline, global GDP growth? Again, we have two competing responses. Yeah, I think we had some, most of the colleagues could respond. So there are, again, no one thinks that it actually led to, there's a projection of GDP growth. Some colleagues ended up with 4 to 5% global decline. The others were more depressive with 15, 18% decline. So let's see what actually the results are. So this actually leads me to the first presentation. And the first presentation, the first topic will focus on socioeconomic trends during the COVID crisis and some emerging policy suggestions. So this will come up with some macroeconomic projections and policy recommendations. So for this, I will pass the floor to my colleague, George Buma, who is the team leader of the Sustainable Development Cluster in Istanbul Regional Hub. So he has over 25 years of experience. With his experience, he's our SDG public finance and SDG finance guru, and is now currently also leading the research work on the COVID socioeconomic impact assessments, and will share with us some insights about how the macroeconomic situation looks. So George, I'm passing the floor to you, over to you, and thank you.
Sorry, I'm just having some technical issues here, but just bear with me. Okay. So, good morning, colleagues, and just let me share the screen with you. Okay, so great. Thanks very much, Berna, and I hope you can all hear me okay. A real pleasure to join this call, and I wanted to just kind of start off by highlighting that we are beginning to see a number of data coming from a lot of the socioeconomic assessments that UNDP has been doing in various countries. And these are kind of beginning to show some interesting results, which I'll share with you today. And then probably I'll also then talk a little bit about the implications of this on development financing issues, and finish with a little bit of perhaps crystal ball gazing in terms of what we see in the future, and how development trends are kind of playing out as a result of COVID, and particularly what UNDP is trying to do in terms of looking at some of the transformational perspectives of development going forward as a result of recovery from COVID. So firstly, to just come back to the issue of macroeconomic issues, and I think the question was a good introduction into the situation, and these figures you see here are just a small selection of, I guess, IMF predicted impacts from April in 2020, which kind of highlight a kind of declines of 4 to 8 percentage points reduction in GDP growth from their October forecasts. And I think the majority of people kind of put this down as the kind of predicted impact on GDP. However, as the June figures or the June quarter figures begin to become available, we are seeing that perhaps these estimates were a little bit optimistic. And we are seeing perhaps variable implications of COVID lockdown policies on GDP growth. And much of this is, I would kind of highlight as linked to probably macroeconomic structural issues in different countries. And if we have a look at the data here, we look at the predicted impacts on Georgia's GDP. And this would, I would hazard a guess and say this is largely linked to the high reliance of Georgia on tourism and hospitality industry, and the fact that this is taking a big hit, which I think most of us also highlighted the greater impacts on tourism and hospitality that are occurring. But more importantly, what these lockdown measures are showing is that some of the pre-COVID trends are actually accelerating and highlighting some of the weaknesses in the economic models that exist in some of the middle income countries. Trends around, declining foreign direct investment, trends around, increases in the desire for digitalization, trends around precarious labor markets, these kinds of issues which are really coming to the fore and highlighting some of the structural weaknesses, particularly around social welfare, social services, weaknesses in economic complexity and the different sectoral impacts that are occurring. So I think that there's a lot of supply and demand shocks that kind of play into this. And I think, originally we looked at a V-shaped recovery, or we hoped for a V-shaped recovery, but I think in reality, as we kind of work through this pandemic and we're now 6-7 months into it, we're beginning to realize that, with the influence of a health pandemic, how we manage economic issues going from lockdown into more opening up policies, that we probably won't go back to where we were before, and that we have to recognize that there will be weaknesses in the macroeconomic picture going forward, and whether a cure or a vaccine kind of solves this problem, I think is still very much a question that people want a positive response to, but what we're still kind of, I think, trying to figure out in how to navigate through this. And why is the macroeconomic picture important? Because we understand in the different country context that there's different channels that are occurring in terms of the way that the lockdown policies and the need to restrict activity in the economy to manage the curve and the infections, that there's different channels of impact that are occurring. From an income perspective, obviously the biggest impacts that are occurring in the private sector in terms of SMEs and businesses that are having to reduce employment or reduce hours of workers is having an impact, and we're seeing this is having a much greater impact in urban areas. I think it's also having an impact on other issues in the broader economy, and such as the potential impact on food costs, on the cost of staples, particularly for countries who have a high level of import. The increasing level of health costs that comes with the pandemic, and the cost of utilities are all eroding savings in this context where households are suffering from reduced income levels. And this is, of course, having an impact on people's savings and also people's spending habits, which in turn, has a cyclical effect on the macroeconomic picture. We do see that there are rising levels of income poverty, and depending very much on the suitability of the social welfare systems, this is having different impacts as well, and particularly we see one of the biggest affected sections of the society are the informal sectors, and there's a significant impact, particularly on youth and women, given that these two groups are probably the ones in most vulnerable employment, the gig economy, informal contracts, daily wage labour, etc. And this would be the disproportional impacts on these groups are much greater than they are on other sections in society. And of course, we can't limit ourselves to income measures only. We also see that multidimensional perspectives are really important in terms of the socioeconomic impacts in terms of education and health. And, the impact of lockdown policies on the way this is having gendered impacts, particularly on women in terms of increases in gender-based violence, the burden sharing in terms of care and school closures, and these kinds of things are kind of seemingly having significant impacts going forward. So shifting to the private sector, and we're beginning to get a picture of the impact on the micro, small and medium enterprises, which are going to be most affected by this. And the big question that's coming out at the moment is a lot of the liquidity that is being provided through a lot of these emergency measures are directed at keeping the private sector afloat. And the question that's coming out is how much of this liquidity is keeping businesses afloat that will eventually become bankrupt. And I think that there's an increasing recognition that there will be, once all this is over, there will be a number of businesses that will become bankrupt, but perhaps this picture is a little unclear until many of these emergency measures begin to wind back, or the situation begins to ease in terms of the pandemic. And the question is, what will we go back to going forward? As I kind of said in the opening slide, I think is an uncertain question. The supply side shocks, disruption in value chains, the changes that we've seen in terms of global supply chains being disrupted, and the largest demand side shocks in those services sector, as mentioned before. I think the regional disparities on this reflect on perhaps some of the policies that will be needed in recovery. In that we perhaps can't expect that macroeconomic policy settings that were there previously will be suitable post-COVID. And I think that these are still kind of issues that are being discussed and worked through in many government corridors. So if I pivot now to the issue of finance, which I think is really a relevant one, and how it links to ODA, but also private sector, and what was the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals, and how much this has been pushed into the background as a result of the pandemic. And I think everybody kind of is struggling to understand how to deal with the financial shocks that are occurring, that the governments will have a reduced tax base, there will be less revenue, that there will be less business activity. So, how are governments going to deal with this, and how is the private sector going to, evolve in perhaps situations where reform policies have been lagging and new stimulus might be needed? So there's kind of circumstances where many countries will have to do more with less, and we fear that perhaps some of these policies for recovery will be a trade-off, and that we do need to keep a focus on you know, the fact that inequalities are rising and that social welfare and social equity issues are going to become more increasingly relevant for the policymakers because, you know, if we just go back to previous settings, we're going to have a whole new group of underclass which will not be able to participate, and this will have dire consequences for social cohesion, I think, and social justice going forward. So many of these things are connected to levels of poverty and vulnerability and what requests come in terms of how ODA is directed going forward.
We'll have to wrap up.
Sure. I've got one more slide after this, but I think I wanted to make the most relevant point here is that what we've found in many of the countries is that the linkages between development planning and development finances are quite weak. And we see a need for that to be strengthened more deeply in governance processes to have a stronger recovery. And my last slide, and just, you know, we do see that, you know, the crisis is proving that economic structural changes are being introduced faster than before. And we see that there's a need to reflect on a number of key policy areas in terms of resilient recovery, and not least is the green transition, you know, the digital economy, which seems to be on the top of everyone's mind at the moment. But with that, reducing the informal economy, which is having such a massive impact on households and incomes, and the need to reflect on some of the human development dimensions. So that was a very quick overview of what we see as coming out from the socioeconomic and the financing issues and the need to be more deliberate in these areas. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Berna.
Thank you very much, George. Colleagues, if you have any immediate questions or comments to George, we might have some time for that. And as we move to the second, I mean, I took note of the impacts on the individuals, vulnerable communities, public finance with less tax collection, and also implications on social assistance schemes for vulnerable communities, but also the need for the liquidity increases and resilience aspects of businesses and SMEs. So there, I mean, the policy options come up with serious trade-off decisions, and there's actually a lot of issues that needs to be addressed, is what I got from George's presentation. So I don't know if, I don't see any hands. If we have any question or comment, we'll look for that. Otherwise, I'll move forward to the second presentation, second session. So the next one is will be presented by Karen Smith, the program coordinator of Connecting Business Initiative. This is a collective initiative focusing on businesses and enterprises during crisis. Karen will talk more about that. But this is an introduction, and Karen has a long-standing experience in both business partnerships and advice, as well as crisis response in a wide range of organizations. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Karen, and the floor is yours for your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and really thanks for the opportunity to introduce the Connecting Business Initiative, or CBI as we call it. I'm just going to share my screen, start the slideshow. Can you see it? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So CBI was launched in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit with the goal of increasing the resilience of businesses and communities while integrating the private sector networks into disaster management mechanisms. We support business networks to engage more effectively with other actors at the country level, including government, civil society, UN and development mechanisms, and of course, affected populations. The aim of CBI is to engage the private sector before, during, and after crisis. We're jointly supported by OCHA and UNDP. And you know, we're a working example of how humanitarian development and peace cooperation, collaboration can work together. Just hold on a second. There we go. Apologies, technical challenges. So at the country level, CBI networks collaborate with the private sector, government, UN organizations, and NGOs. The CBI community has been built over the last 4 years since we've been launched and has played a critical role in disaster response and recovery for a range of crises, as you can see, from natural disasters to man-made and, of course, COVID-19. In 2019, together with our partners, CBI member networks responded to a total of 31 emergencies. In practical terms, we do this through our member networks, which are business-led networks at the country level. And for example, Arda, our next speaker, is a member of our Turkish network that hosts CBI. So in regards to COVID-19, CBI has aligned with the global efforts to engage the private sector in supporting the 3 UN global platforms. So the first one, which you're all familiar with, is the WHO Strategic Preparedness and Response Plan, the OCHA-led Global Humanitarian Response Plan, and of course, as George was discussing, the UN Socioeconomic Framework, which is offered by UNDP and UNDCO. As a result, our focus is supporting the health response, strengthening crisis management, and addressing socioeconomic impacts. We support 3 types of groups through this work: member networks, the UN system, and private sector companies and the broader public. For our member networks, we offer technical support, guidance, resources, and connections. So for example, we've provided, and this is an example of like using low amounts of money, we've provided small grants to 8 member networks in the range between $20,000 to $60,000 to support their COVID-19 response, which has been, quite impactful for them. So on the right, you can see the 4 categories of activities in which CBI supports our member networks to contribute to the response: and risk containment, mitigation, communications, public outreach, economic impact and business continuity, and advocacy and policy dialogue. At the global level, we work with UN partners and serve as an entry point to link private contributions to crisis. So for example, we co-facilitate the UN Emergency Private Sector Focal Points meeting at the global level. And through that, we produce business guides and coordinate how we all respond and to make sure we're not overlapping. And through our website, we engage the broader public by providing information, online courses, tools, webinars, and events. So just to give you some specific examples, the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, PDRF, is our member network in the Philippines. They launched a project to fund the distribution of grocery vouchers to the urban poor. It was worth approximately US 30 million and reached over 7.6 million people. And PDRF is also supporting the private sector in various areas such as food security, health, logistics, and risk communications, and a number of other projects. Another example is Vanuatu. Vanuatu was the first country to have a major natural disaster during COVID-19, when the country was under lockdown. Tropical Cyclone Harold, it was a Category 5. Nobody was allowed in or out of the country. And VBRC, the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council, which is our local network, provided a coordination mechanism for the private sector to engage with the government and partners to address what we call a double emergency or a confluence of crisis. They activated their preparedness measures. They conducted aerial, ground, and marine assessments to further plan the next steps and shared those with other partners. Responded to their telecommunications teams. They were already deployed in advance to reconnect the islands after the cyclone, as well as shipping and logistics. So they assisted in supplying over 1,000 remote coastal households with 35 tons of food and NFIs over an 8-week period. With this, all the resources were provided by VBRC, and a very small amount of money had a very large impact. And as we can see, this example demonstrates the importance of local private sector as a local response mechanism, particularly times of COVID when things are locked down and there's no other, the typical response mechanisms are not able to be deployed. Some of the other activities that our networks have done during the COVID response, as you can see, in many countries, for example, the networks are working with governments in the UN system to support healthcare systems and PPE production. Multiple networks are engaged in coordination, communication, and policy dialogues. they're also working on economic impact assessment, support to SMEs and business continuity. And I'm sure Arda might highlight some of the great work that they've done with their detailed assessments of SMEs in the next session. In terms of the tools that CBI develops, we provide a range of tools and resources, mainly targeting private sector networks. However, some of those tools might be useful for both governments and the UN. These include guidance and resources, for example, how to set up and strengthen private sector networks, how to conduct programmatic activities, how to understand risks. We also provide technical support for programmatic work. We organize webinars and events on topics such as COVID-19 response and recovery, business continuity planning, man-made disasters, impact measurement, disaster management, innovations, amongst other things. We also have online trainings on our website. We recently launched an e-learning academy to further build the capacity of the private sector in disaster management. We have a community of practice for member networks, which includes a WhatsApp group, and we share best practices through newsletters and webinars with that group. And in regard to the final point in catalytic funding, I mentioned earlier, we just recently provided small grants to 8 of our member networks to support their COVID response. Some specific tools that we have developed are the Network Foundation Guide. We also developed a man-made disaster toolkit last year for private sector networks, because there's not a lot of resources for networks. A lot of the stuff is targeted, a lot of information available is targeted toward individual companies. We are also currently developing guidance on gender, AI technology, health emergencies, emergency operation centers, amongst many other things, and that's all available on our website, and will be as we develop it. And finally, I just want to mention, we're supported by a number of partners who are members of our executive committee, including BCG, EU, the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, IFRC, the UN Global Compact, UFPS, and USAID. And that's it for today. A very quick overview of CBI and some of our activities, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
And very strict to time limits too. Thank you very much, Karen.
You're most welcome.
So we really wanted to have Karen present the CBI experience, because it's actually a very good example of collective response to crisis, bringing together businesses and their networks, and it's actually a global initiative. And we also wanted to hear about the resources and services available for our partners and their partners. So that's actually very relevant to our topic. So I'm actually checking if we have any questions. Please, colleagues, if you have any question or comments to Karen, you can share that. In the meantime, actually, we received one question for Karen on our community of on SparkBlue. So Karen, maybe I can address this on behalf of our participants. So are there any programs or policies which could be taken as proven highly effective in SME recovery, particularly for COVID-19? So is there any immediately emerging responses for SMEs and businesses? Can you share your immediate responses if possible?
Yeah, I mean, our networks are all working with SMEs. I mean, that's the majority of their membership. I think Arda might be able to give more specific examples in his presentation. Sorry, Arda, to put you on the spot because you're the next speaker. But in terms of, I think it really depends on the context. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that different countries have different needs for their SMEs, right? So, I mean, we have a lot of tools on our website, and if they're looking at a specific country, I'd be happy to talk to, I don't know who raised the question, but I'd be happy to discuss it with them afterward if that's helpful. And we can also share that information with the broader community.
Yeah, I mean, and we will also share the links and connections in our SparkBlue for those who might be interested.
Great.
Okay. I don't see or hear any questions. So actually, Karen made a lot of mention of Arda's presentation. So maybe we can.
There's one question.
Oh, I missed it. Sorry.
from, it says, does your initiative cover social entrepreneurship? There's
Some of
a
the
question.
Okay, thank you so much. So we work with existing business networks and they host the CBI. And so some of those are working with social entrepreneurs, but not all of them. And you know, the networks vary in capacity. So from something like the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, which has a full-time staff of like, I think it's around 26 people that works on this all the time, to volunteer-led networks, for example, in Fiji and in Vanuatu, that are, you know, a subset of the Chamber of Commerce. So, you know, they have different levels of capacity. But there are some that are working with social entrepreneurs, although that hasn't been a target focus of the work to date, but there is some work around that. And we could share some of those examples if that's helpful. I'm conscious of time and getting into too many details, but it varies. And I'm sorry if that's kind of a vague response, but it is true that, you know, we have different, there's the private sector networks themselves determine what they want to focus on. So if social entrepreneurship is important for them, they do that, but not all of them do.
I'm happy to also share our experience with entrepreneurship. It's not within the CBI mandate, but from CBI we do have some programs dwelling on social entrepreneurship. If that's an area of interest, I'm happy to expand on it.
Great, thanks, Arda.
Maybe you can actually do it after your speech, Arda, I mean, as part of that, or maybe just as we are on this topic, maybe you could share some of the responses, whichever way you prefer.
All right, so if I may, I'd like to start on the impact of COVID on enterprise and needs. That's going to be my focus for today. So I'm going to talk.
Maybe let me introduce you to the audience, just the way we did for the others. I mean, actually, Karen provided a lot of leeway for this presentation and talked about business networks. So Arda is actually representing one of those business networks in Turkey, one of the largest ones. So he's the Secretary General of Turkish Enterprise and Business Confederation, Turkonfed. So it's a non-governmental business organization representing the private sector point in different platforms, policymaking environments, and also doing policy work for the businesses and SMEs. So So without further ado, sorry for interrupting, but let me pass the floor to you. And it would be really good to hear from you the actual first-hand information on how the private sector was impacted, responding and living through the issue. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No. Okay, let's add to that introduction also that we're a proud member of the CBI network. And also, other than the policy design and advocacy part, we also do have a capacity building pillar, or geared mostly towards SMEs. So I'll start with the survey that we conducted together with this Business for Goals platform that we have set up about 2 years ago, well, 1.5 years ago, and it's a platform that's a consortium of comprising of Turkonfed, my institution, TÜSİAD, another large business association in Turkey that comprises mostly of the Fortune 500 companies. Turkonfed membership base is more so SMEs. And then, of course, the UNDP. So it's one of a kind, the first of its kind platform. And we're proud to have initiated in Turkey. And the aim of the platform is to create awareness and design projects that focus on SDGs. And so that SDGs are internalized by the private sector, which of course has become more prevalent, especially with this COVID reality. So we've been trying to push the agenda of SDGs across the private sector in Turkey. So the survey that we did 2 surveys, one in mid-March and another in mid-May. And the aim of the survey was to assess the impact of COVID on enterprises and assess their needs. I won't get too much into the details, but we'll be sending the link of these surveys which are in English. And there's a lot more details and information in the PDF files that I'll be sending you. The main findings of the surveys, I'll start with the March survey. None of this is really surprising to you, but I think these are all important information in identifying the needs of especially the SMEs. So the survey covered about 800 enterprises in Turkey across all regions of Turkey. And one of the main findings is that the impact was mostly felt by the small businesses. 36% of micro and small scale companies have suspended, had suspended their activities. It's a huge number. While the rate of companies whose revenue fell by more than half exceeds 50%. Again, huge. And this rate reaches 71% in southeastern part of Turkey. George alluded to this fact about the regional differences, and this of course points to the fact that there's of course regional differences within Turkey also. And I would like to repeat that number: 71% was affected in the southeastern part of Turkey, which is economically a lesser developed part of Turkey. Now, the revenues, again, I'd like to repeat this data. More than 50% of the enterprises reported a loss of 50% of their revenues. Again, huge number. And this is the mid-March survey that I'm referring to. Now, coming to the crisis management, only 8% of all the enterprises stated that their business is going as usual without shifting to crisis management, while 32% stated that they partially started crisis management, and another 29% have started crisis management intensely. So that also shows that the crisis management culture is not very prevalent among the SMEs especially. And you have to understand really the SME culture, and I think this doesn't go for Turkey, but it's a global phenomenon. The regular SME, he struggles from day to day. I mean, he doesn't have these, strategic tools, these strategic plans, short, middle, long-term plans. And unfortunately, this is the reality with SMEs across the globe. That's why when a crisis hits, whether this is, the COVID crisis or a natural disaster, unfortunately, this is felt harder in the SMEs than the larger companies. So this, I think, is another item that we need to highlight. Again, not only for COVID, but for all crises, which is, of course, within the CBI mandate. Now, the infrastructure, I'd like to talk about the infrastructure a little bit. 51% of respondents stated that infrastructure and digital means of their enterprise are not adequate for telecommunication. Again, huge number. I mean, 51% have stated that their infrastructure simply doesn't suffice to deal with COVID or, for that matter, any other crisis. The rate is 52% in Istanbul, which is, of course, the biggest city in Turkey, 40% in the Aegean, which is the western coastal area of Turkey, 26% in the Mediterranean, and 16% in the southeastern Anatolia. According to the survey, top 3 expectations of SMEs. So we're now moving towards the needs of the SMEs. Top 3 expectations of SMEs in the fight with the coronavirus include postponement of payment of bills, taxes, and social security contributions, tax discounts, and financial support. Again, George touched on this issue. I mean, the financial part, of course, again, SMEs are really hit hard. They do not, their liquidity rate is usually a lot lower than the bigger enterprises. They need to manage their finances on a day-to-day basis. So, usually a common SME in Turkey, and I think globally, their revenue comes out of, 1 month of their annual income, right? And when we're talking about 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, or even, now we don't know how long it's going to last. Months and months of losses, you can imagine how hard the SMEs are being hit. Now I'm moving to the May survey, which is very much complementary to the March findings. I'll just highlight some of the key findings over here. 64% of enterprises deferred new investments and growth plans. This points to the survey question that you asked in the very beginning of this seminar, which touches on the GDP growth. So when we're talking about 64% of enterprises deferring new investments, you know, that of course has a big reflection on the GDP growth. Increased workload due to COVID-19 crisis affected women workers. We asked a separate set of questions for women. Of course, we wanted to have a better understanding on the impact of, you know, the gender differences. So women have been hit hard with COVID, and the COVID crisis was reported to have higher impact, particularly on women workers due to the increased domestic responsibilities such as childcare. Another data is that 59% of the enterprises are not prepared against a second wave of COVID-19 pandemic. And looking now into the future, of course, this data is, and I don't want to be morbid, but the data unfortunately points to a morbid scenario. And now, as we're discussing now in Turkey, the second wave of COVID. So these are the main findings of the surveys. Now, maybe, I don't know how much time I have, but maybe we could talk briefly about what institutions, you know, whether, you know, government institutions or independent institutions like Turconfed can do. I pointed to the needs of the enterprises, the financial needs, you know, putting those aside, that's in the mandate of the government. Institutions such as Turconfed obviously cannot distribute finances. That's the responsibility of the government. But what institutions like Turconfed can do is help with, you know, prepare with the with such crises as with, you know, the CBI network. We can help them with new markets. We can help them with digitalization, with tools such as virtual expos, trainings, again, on digitalization, e-commerce, and crisis management. And that's exactly what we've been doing. What Turconfed did starting from early March is we shifted all of our training programs online, some of which were already online. Now 100% of our programs are online. We had set up, again, first of its kind in Turkey, a center for digital transformation for SMEs. We have, starting from late March, we have been giving free coaching to SMEs on their digital transformation with a team of experts. And we've been doing awareness creating campaigns on how to shift commercial doings into the digital age, e-commerce, so to speak. So these are some of the projects that we've been dwelling on for the past few months. And of course, it's never enough, but you know, you got to start somewhere. The financial support, of course, is important. Again, George alluded to this, but so did Karen. When we're talking about crises, whether it's the COVID crisis or any other crisis, there's huge disparities among countries. And beyond that, also within countries, there are huge differences between the regions of the countries. I shared with you the data of Western Turkey as opposed to Eastern Turkey, huge differences. We're talking about 71% of loss of revenue for the southeastern part of Turkey, whereas that goes down to about 30% for the western part of Turkey. Huge gap. So when we're talking about development, when we're talking about designing programs, we need to take into consideration these differences. And I'll end there. I think that's all the time I have, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I didn't talk about social entrepreneurship, but if you want me to follow up on that, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you very much, Arda. I think, I mean, it was a great example of how the networks and platforms can work actually in this type of development challenge. And I mean, the figures that you give are also in line with what George mentioned. I mean, the projections are actually, as time goes, the projections and assessments are getting grimmer. So, and the same goes for the situation that the SMEs are facing. So the policy recommendations or the needs that you have identified, I think, I mean, is relevant for most of the countries that we are all working in. So, so I would like to open the floor to any question, and just to, in the chat box, you might see the link that Arda shared with the colleagues. With everyone, so you could also visit the link to see more of the assessments and the findings. Colleagues, any question from the audience that we might share? Any comments that you would like to share? Maybe from your own experience working on this situation, the COVID response. I don't see any hands. I hear some keyboard ticking, but
Sorry, that's me.
I don't know. Okay. Okay. I don't, maybe, I mean, Arda, because we had this question, social entrepreneurship, maybe we could maybe very briefly touch upon that. And we have one question also on the, maybe we could start with you and also share that with other colleagues. So in responding and for recovery in COVID-19, which would be the most relevant private sector actors that we could engage with in development cooperation? So what kind of rules, regulations would be needed to ensure a long-lasting impact, partnership, and effective solutions? So this is a question that, again, we received from Sparkblue. I don't know if that is clear to our participants. Maybe you could elaborate on that a bit for the partners that we might work together with.
Are you giving the floor to me?
Yeah. Yes, please.
I'll start with the latter question on which institutions they want to engage. Again, it differs from country to country, but when you look at the Turkish case, there are government agencies. And then there are independent institutions, and then international institutions. Some of the efforts for the COVID-19 crisis management have been done in concerted efforts among these actors, and some have not. In the beginning, it wasn't concerted as would be expected in any crisis. Everyone tries to do their own thing, and the channels of communication are not as open as they should be. But now we are moving towards a more concerted effort. My simple advice to you would be doing a mapping on which actor is providing what kind of services and support, and identify what support you need, and then engage the actor. That would be my advice to you. As I said, in most countries, in some countries, these efforts are not concerted. So when you go to one actor, it gives support that might not be necessarily provided by another actor. So one, understand what you need, and two, find out who might be the best fitted actor who can give that support. So that would be my general answer. Does that answer the question?
I guess so. Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe other speakers as well on who to partner with. And maybe this also, I mean, that could also be linked to another question about whether we see more cooperation and concerted action in response to COVID. I mean, there is a lot of momentum that we see and cooperation with the partners, but if that actually is indeed happening, and this is a global crisis, so are everyone working more collectively for a better, effective response? Karen,
I mean,
George,
go ahead, George.
Karen, no, please, go ahead.
So very briefly, at the local level, I mean, I think we're seeing it everywhere, but where we have networks, I mean, that have already established relationships, usually in response to emergencies, the work on COVID is, work more fluidly because they already have established those relationships with the different government partners. Now, it might be different parts of the government or different organizations, but that kind of multi-stakeholder partner approach has really helped because no one actor can address the breadth of this. So we're seeing, and of course, there's increased interest in kind of participating in these forums by the different actors as well. And the networks have played a really critical role in preparing and responding to COVID, and just having that engagement with the different places that they've established before helps. It's always difficult to establish at the time. It takes time. You can do it, but this is why it's better to kind of establish these networks in the quiet times, although we don't have any right now, unfortunately. But George, go ahead. I know we're short on time, and
just a reflection on the bigger picture, because I think Karen and Adu made some really interesting observations there on the situation on the ground, because much will depend in terms of how the economies open up going forward, and what happens in terms of connections between Europe and in the East with Russia, because many of these economies are intertwined with both Europe and Russia in many respects. And so the small and medium enterprises firstly are largely occupied in the services industry, and this is why there's a very strong geographic impact on this, because the different regions within the countries are being affected differently. And so one thing that is coming out of the surveys is, how do these businesses actually reflect on the idea that they might need to go to the digital economy much more quickly than they had planned to originally, and is this a kind of survival strategy that's going to help them come out of this more effectively? And I think that that's an emerging question which everybody is trying to grapple with at the moment, and certainly the small and medium enterprises that are kind of working in many of the services industries. This is not possible for them, but how do you kind of then create other sectoral kind of responses where the digital economy comes into play? So there's a lot of structural issues that sit behind this issue, and so identifying which sectors to work with and which businesses to work with is a really important step that needs to be undertaken going forward, because the general stimulus coming from economic growth is not going to be common across the economy. It's going to be quite scattered.
Okay. Thank you, George, Karen, Arda, to all of you for responding. I don't know, colleagues, participants, do we have any question? I don't see any hands up or a chat box question, right? So actually, we also come to the, Saran, are you? Okay. So we're actually come to the end of the time allocated for this webinar. So we're closing it now, but please feel free to visit the Community of Practice platform, SparkBlue. So here is the information about that. So, and we are also trying to facilitate discussions there, share information, knowledge, and we will also share all the presentations and relevant resource information, both shared here, but also some others that haven't been shared here on the platform. So we look forward to having all of you there. And we would also like to invite you to the other upcoming webinars that we will have. So next week at the same time, we will have yet another webinar on communications, if I'm not wrong, right, Saran? So
yes, we have 3 webinars dedicated to communications for development, and next week we'll start with the first one. So it's going to be exciting. So don't forget to register.
Okay, please register for the next webinars, and also join the discussions and visit SparkBlue for any relevant information that might come. And we also see, I mean, a question raised on SparkBlue also has been responded by Arda. So, so I think we're ready to close this chapter, and we look forward to meeting all of you and your colleagues, partners next week, the same time, jointly, and have a great week and weekend, all of you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you all, and thank
Thank
you for
you.
our speakers too a lot. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.